Our first speaker tonight describes his own trajectory better than I ever can. He says that he has spent the better part of his life, or pretty much the whole of his professional life, at two iconic companies. One, HUL, which is the most Indian multinational corporation for decades, and the second, the Tatas, which is the most international Indian corporation for decades. Together, they constitute 51 years of our Gopalakrishnan's professional career. But they don't just constitute 51 years. Those are years in which these two companies have shaped the very landscape of the corporate and business world, but have also touched pretty much every one of us sitting here in this room, and all of us in urban India at some point. Gopal, of course, spent 31 years at HUL, followed by 20 years at the Tatas, including as director of Tata Sons, and he was vice chairman of the HUL board, and so on. But he has been more than just a presence on the boards. He has been one of those corporate leaders who demands more, not just from companies, but from society itself. He demands that companies and their leaders, those who run and make them, do more than just build institutions. They build societies and they help build nations. Why does he believe that it falls on a corporation to engage with the idea of nation building, and how can leaders go about that is the very conversation we're going to have. It's my privilege to invite up on stage R. Gopalakrishnan. It's the light a bit bright. Thank you for being here. You know, I wanted to start because the idea of leadership has clearly occupied you for a while, and you did just write your 9th book called Doodles on Leadership. Why was the idea of leadership so important to you? And what is, I know you offer up the idea of 3 balconies of leadership in the book. What are the 3 balconies of leadership? But first, why is leadership so important to you?
You know, we all use the word leadership. And I think we all pretty much mean the same thing, but we are not terribly sure what exactly we mean. So there are a lot of approximations which coalesce into a jelly of a jumble. And I thought I would like to add to that confusion by placing my own views. And I've called it doodles because, as you know, the word doodle in the English language is a bit mindless exercise. And I thought I would offer a point of view. There are political leaders, there are scientific leaders, there are sports leaders, but there are also business leaders. On the subject of what are those 3 balconies, 50 years is a lot of time. And when I reflect back, as my grandmother would have said, had she been alive, she said, you spent your whole life selling soap. And that would be an unfair reprimand, because I think I've derived a lot more out of my professional life than just selling soap. And I realized that my journey is not dissimilar to the journey of any other person in this room. It's like climbing the Qutub Minar, and you get tired after some time, but you reach the first balcony when you learn to run a function. You're the chief marketing officer, chief financial officer, where a group of people who are similarly aligned are all pulled together by you, and that's one level of leadership. I call it the transactional level of leadership. And then the steep climb ahead, the stairs get narrower, you reach what I call corporate leadership. When you find that there are substantial differences of view amongst various functions, and rather than do the functions, you're required to sort them out and get everybody aligned. It's like a bunch of people who are in different directions. And then if you're lucky to carry on with the journey, it really gets steep and thin in the staircase. You reach what I've called societal leadership. When suddenly the view from there of what you have seen earlier is very different. Just like if you go to the top of Qutub Minar, it looks quite different to see the landscape than when you're on the first floor. And I thought I would like to write my book from those 3 perspectives, all of which I have been very fortunate to have experienced and enjoyed. And I wanted to remind my readers, certainly those who are in my sort of age group, have all experienced that, but they have not thought of it that way. And I just wanted to tickle your imagination to say this is the great satisfaction. You know, I'm a bit tired of guys who say, Army people are in national service. IAS people do national service. And unfortunately, there are enough of the business ilk who feature in the pink papers every morning. So they all look like a bunch of crooks. Some of them are. Business has many crooks. But the one thing I can say is it has no more crooks than journalists, politicians.
Now you've just picked the worst of humankind to compare them to.
Because it's a reflection of society. And I refuse to accept that army people serve the nation or IAS. They all serve the nation beautifully well. And so do business. And business people must take pride in what they're doing. You create jobs, you create economic growth, you create development. You know, it's like the petrol in an engine. You may have the best engine, the best transmission, the best gearbox, the best finish of the car, but if you have no petrol, then nothing works. And business is the petrol of society. Governments and police and judiciary are the gearbox and the transmissions.
So, you have an interesting formulation that you call experience before theory, which is rather at odds at the traditional way of, theory or concept usually comes first and experience follows. What do you mean by experience before theory, and why experience before theory?
Well, it's a very convenient positioning for me, because if I say theory before experience, I would have no qualification to sit there. After my retirement from active managerial work, I'm associated with 2 academic institutions, and I realized that those were academics who had theory before experience. So I was an oddball sitting amongst them. But that has led to some very interesting outcomes, which I won't go into now. But my positioning is experience before theory. And I think it's so important because management is a performing art. It is no different from the person who's going to play the piano later this evening. No 2 performances are the same. I might turn around a company today in one particular set of techniques. You put me into another company with a different context, the same techniques will not work. And that's why CEOs who are immensely successful in one situation are not necessarily successful, and some of them are blissfully, are terribly unsuccessful in other situations. So I call it a performing art. A performing art is one, unlike science, where you do the same thing again and again and you get different outcomes. And since it is a performing art, and that is the art in which you have done, experience becomes very important. You cannot learn a performing art. You can't learn cricket by watching TV and being told at what pace you must deliver the ball from your fingers. You do it by learning. And that's why I say experience before theory.
I'd like to spend a little time talking about your time between HUL and the Tatas. They're 2 radically different types of companies. HUL, highly process-driven, and the Tatas, well, seemingly more personality-driven, individualistic in that way. You've made a successful career at both. Will you tell us a little bit about what was to you special about each corporation, and what did it take for you to change gear when you shifted from HUL to the Tatas?
Yeah, they are very different companies, just like 2 individuals, 2 brothers in the same family are different. You realize the differences only when you come up close. Unilever is a very Anglo-Dutch company. And an Anglo-Dutch company gets its philosophical moorings from Greek sense of logic, which, for example, says your task is to sort out the ambiguous. And the world must be positioned, the world or the business problem must be positioned with something very clear: good, bad, right, wrong, do, don't do, etc. The Indian way of looking at things is, दुनिया में माया है. We don't know. It's all fuzzy. हो सकता है कि इसमें clarity हो सकता है कि clarity नहीं हो. They're very different philosophical traditions. Indian philosophical tradition is conceptual. जो किसी ने सोचा नहीं है, मैं सोच रहा हूँ. Concept of zero. The Anglo-Saxon tradition is different. I won't describe each one because all of us are victims of the Anglo-Saxon tradition and perhaps a bit innocent of the Indian tradition. This applies in management as well. So the attitude, for example, to ethics. I'm not judging which is right or wrong, but I'm just taking as an example so that it doesn't sound like Indian philosophy, airy-fairy and up in the air. Um, I joined long time ago, 67. And a particular junior person in sales had charged first class trains ticket prices, but he traveled interclass. In those days, we had something called interclass. The difference in fare, the journey was from Madurai to Trichy, so it's not a huge distance. It's like going from here to Ambala or something. And it was 8 rupees. This came to light, and since the Anglo-Dutch logic says you're either right or wrong, there's a thin line separating the two, he was sacked. And he was sacked after 35 years of service with 2 daughters to be married, and you can imagine all the appurtenances of this. And I suppose we were taught this to say, never cross the line. And I grew up with that. Then I came to Tata's. And in Tata's, a little girl, a secretarial girl, in her medical expenses, she put 100 and then a little zero was put on the 1. So it now looked like 900. And there is always, in an insurance company, employs people with very fine eyesight. And they must have sat with a magnifying glass, figured it out, and it turned out that she had fudged it. When confronted, she confessed that she had had a sick mother, she was a single woman, had a huge number of problems. And Tata's took a very different view. They said, we won't sack her because she has a problem. But we will stop her increment. You can't just let her go scot-free. And so they accepted. Now, both of them solved a problem, but in very different ways. There are many examples I could give of this nature, but I thought I would illustrate this for you.
Is there one that resonated more with you, one that was closer to your natural way? Was the Indian way more close to you?
No, the challenge was for me, not for the companies, because Tata's had been running for 100 years before I joined, and so had Unilever. I came out of Unilever thinking that's the way life is led. I went into Tata and people said that's the way we lead our lives. And who do you think had to change? Not the whole of Tata's. I wasn't stupid to expect all of Tata's to change. So really, it required me to remind myself of an experience I had had. I had been driving an ambassador car in Bombay, which, as you know, has very orderly traffic. And I had a driving license for 30 years or 25 years. I was posted to London, and I failed my driving test. And the Bobby, who sort of took my test, said, sir, we will be helpful. We'll tell you what you did wrong. And then he gave me all these things. And I said, you know, I've been driving a car for 25 years in India, and you failed me in my driving test. He said, sir, the problem is that you learned how to move the car, but not to drive. And when he said it, I was offended, but I think he was right. And when I came from Lever to Tata, I said there are many ways to skin the cat. This is surely a performing art. And I went through a phase of rediscovering that there's other ways to do it. And as my friend Arun Mehra here will tell you, unless your mind is open to alternate ways of doing it, you will not adapt, which I did.
You know, culture is always spoken of as one of the hardest things to change in an organization. What is culture? And do you think it can be changed in an organization, especially large organizations?
Culture is like the human brain. It evolves gradually.
Or doesn't?
It does. It does. It does for sure. And anybody who says, I've changed the culture in 3 months' time is not talking. It's like saying, I've just changed his whole brain through surgery. Some people may try that. And some people's brains do need it, but we don't have a solution for that problem yet. So, culture is layer upon layer. It's like archaeology. It's like your history. It's something that you cannot take away the slices from. over a period of time. And I think one of the greatest challenges of organizational transformation is that people don't think enough about culture. And that's a very important part. Culture requires dialogue, discussion, getting minds around it. And change of culture is definitely not only possible, but it does happen. But it takes a lot of time.
Will you have an example where you feel you can give us where you or a leadership team successfully changed an aspect of culture in either company that seemed deep-seated?
I think the one that I'm very privileged to have participated in, since you don't want me to talk of something that I did, was the years between 1991 and say 2004. I'll just take that period because those were the 13, 14 years after liberalization. And for 7 of those years, I was in Hindustan Lever on the board. And for the next 7, I was in Tata. And so I was getting a first-hand view, not only as a spectator, but also as a participant in how we were trying to change culture. I've written about this. It's it's an essay written in the book published by Rakesh Mohan and published by Penguin, as to how did I see the economists talk of the macro level. So much GDP, so much deficit, so much industrial licensing, labor reform. But at the face of the blast furnace, when the heat is on your face, you're dealing with it at a micro level. And so I've described how at the micro level in the two companies, culture changed. Both changed, but in very different ways. And I've described it. Now, if you want me to tell you more about it, you'll have to extend the whole evening for me. You have 2 other speakers, so I will not go into too much into it.
Okay. You know, your first book that you wrote, The Case of the Bonsai Manager, I think, was born out of a particular problem that you faced or a particular business challenge that you faced while chairman of Unilever Arabia. And it's interesting because the book deals with rationality versus intuition, so to speak. Will you tell us what that particular problem was and why, as leader of a large business, did you pick intuition as something to go with over all the big data available to you?
So 2 points I want to make. First is all my books deal with an epiphanic moment for me in the course of my career.
So you've had 9 epiphanies in your life.
I've had 9 epiphanies, and those are my 9 books. Okay? And the first one is the one you're asking about. The second thing was, and is, a belief that if authors can do writing for a business, then why can't business people write their own books? Why should they rely on journalists and people who write hagiographies of great leaders? Because if experience is what teaches you, you know, I don't remember what my trigonometry teacher taught me or my Hindi teacher's poetry, but I do remember small little lessons I learned from maybe my father or uncle or professor. And that's true for everybody in this room and outside as well. And so, coming back to the first book, The Case of the Bonsai Manager, again in a telegraphic way, I went to Jeddah and I was given a project as the chairman of the company to mount a direct assault on Procter & Gamble, who, as you know, are Unilever's competitors worldwide. It's like Pepsi and Coke. For a variety of reasons, Procter & Gamble had 97% market share and Unilever had 1. So it was not exactly, you know, an easy one. It's like the DMK trying to run the national government.
Well, let's just say that you couldn't have made it worse.
Sorry?
You couldn't have made it worse.
I couldn't have made it worse, but there was $15 million, $20 million already invested, and I was going to lead this assault. It was a danger to life and limb. Unilever had spent this $15-20 million developing a plan which had this rather terrifying name called Operation Witch Hunt. I didn't know who was the witch and who was doing the hunting. And it involved making a very compacted product compared to the traditional product. So, hawa nikal ke, you gave a concentrate. It's like fog, you know, the advertising for which you see. So, I walked around and I did my research, My research being walking around and talking to people. And without going into all the detail, I was very respectful. Whenever I heard the market research people and the product development people, they were very persuasive. They had all the calculations, statistical significance, you name it, it was all there. It was very, very convincing. It was analytically, I couldn't fault it. I wasn't trying to fault it, but logically, our product would succeed. But when I walked around the market, I found that for some reason it wouldn't succeed. You see, this compaction of a large product into a small pace started in Japan. And I know from my visits to Japan that there are small little people there who walk around in small, who drive in small cars, in small cities, live in small houses, and in small shops. So if you saved a lot of space, it helped. In Saudi Arabia, it was exactly the opposite. There were huge people walking around with their huge wives and their huge children, driving around in huge cars on huge streets, and living in houses that were enormous. And I said, why would they value the compaction of a big packet of detergent into a small packet? And that's what, said, I've got a classic difference between my intuition and the analysis. Now, I won't go into the story of what happened to that particular episode, but I did act on it. I didn't say let it be because so many directors from the main board were involved. But it caused me to ask myself the question, does the intuition matter or not? And I came to a body of knowledge and reading and experiments, which caused me to say, why don't I convert this into a book? That's how the book got written. And I came, when I finished the whole exercise, to a very profound conclusion. And as you know, the definition of a profound conclusion is that it's so obvious, you Dumbo, you saw it only day before yesterday. But it was always there. Most of us believe we are very rational. But the most important decisions in our life are taken intuitively. Like whom to marry. If you took that rationally, then you're nuts. And whom to stay married to. How do you select a CEO? I mean, you think, how do you set goals for a CEO? I mean, you can tell him market share, this, that, etc. That has the appurtenance of rationality. But if he doesn't get along with you, then, it goes a different way. So I came to the conclusion that people see rationality and intuition as alternatives. They are actually the same continuum. Imagine a pilgrim who's walking along the road with a map and everything, and he comes to a certain point beyond which there is no map. And there's a cliff. He has to decide whether he wants to jump and take a chance or not. That's intuition. And our most important decisions in life are taken intuitively. Since Bishan Singh Bedi is here, how did Virat Kohli decide to appeal that third one, giving Bumrah his hat-trick day before yesterday? That's intuition at the end of the day. He could have got it wrong as well.
You've spoken in another of your books, because you've said that they're all born out of epiphanies or moments of awareness. And, well, When the Penny Drops is another book that you wrote. The title in itself suggests that a penny dropped. What was that penny that dropped for you when you wrote When a Penny Drops?
In my career in Unilever, I had been led to believe, and I blame myself, not anybody who told me, that self-awareness is something you must learn early in your career. So by the time I was 35, I was put through this T group and Joe Harry window and MBTI, and I found I'm an IFPJ or whatever it is. And I thought I've done with it. It's like learning accounting principles. Later on, I realized what Vedanta teaches you is that self-awareness is a late career, late life skill. And those who ignore self-awareness as they grow in the organization or in their social impact are making a big mistake. And then I found an American general who said this in a very American way. which appealed to me and caused me to write the book. The higher the monkey climbs, the more of his backside you can see. So if you've been the chief minister of a state, you see his backside in a particular way. When you become the prime minister, you see the backside in a very different way. So that's the sort of...
Power has occupied your imagination a fair bit, and you've said that power, in your experience, in your opinion, distorts and damages the human brain. What form of power do you mean by that? And what is the form of distortion that you have seen power do, with, whether around you? Do you mean in companies? Do you mean in society? What is that relationship with power you're concerned with?
All forms of power, they may be hierarchical power, they may be authority given to you to do something. All forms of power distort your brain. And we see the evidence of that every morning. Somebody who was perfectly respectable until the other day suddenly seems to have done a lot of gapla, as they say in Bombay. And I got very curious too, and I have been chasing power. If you ask me what are the two things that you've chased throughout your life, again, I think I speak for anybody in this room. Apart from pretty girls, which I used to do when I was younger.
Sorry, what are the pretty girls chasing?
Sorry?
What are the pretty girls chasing?
It's money and power. Those are the two things that one chases. The trouble with both of these is you don't know what to do with it once you've got it. So a lot of people don't know what to do with the money they've got. And the same thing happens with power. Therefore, the nature of its distortion becomes very important. And that caused me to write this book called Crash, which I've done 3 books in the last 1 year. So I'm sorry to refer to them. I'm not trying to prove to you that I'm a copious author, but I'm only trying to answer your question.
What is the nature of that distortion that you've seen? What does it do?
So I've given 7 or 8 pieces of research, not being a neuroscientist or a psychologist. I've produced their papers and referenced them. But the most, since I don't want to run through all 8, the most dramatic one is an allegorical one. That imagine your brain is very plastic, all our brains. And they keep changing their shape. It's like a fried egg, which is not double fried, you know. It keeps changing its shape. And if you can think of it, iron filings, and you put a 2 magnets around it, all the iron filings will realign. You change the magnet either for its strength or the polarity, the iron filings will realign. And that's what happens to your brain. There is a countryman of ours, his name is, I think, Sukhvinder Singh Obi. He's a professor at McMaster University in Canada. And he has a gadget which has got a complicated name, transcranial magnetic resonance imaging machine. And I think he puts the CEO into that machine, then applies various types of power, and then gets a picture of his brain. I say this softly because SEBI may then mandate that all CEOs will be put through a TCMR, and the results have to be reported in the board of directors annual report. Now he found that we have something in our brain called mirror neurons. They are mirror neurons because they are neurons, but they reflect rather than the real thing. And it is, you get empathy for people because of your mirror neurons. Those are active. If my mirror neurons are active, and you come and say that I lost my child, it's my mirror neurons that come and say, oh dear, how terrible, and how can I help, etc. Now what happens with power is your mirror neuron button gets switched off. It's traced back to a particular DNA. It's called M42B or something like that. And that button gets switched off. So now the power may be exercised by the municipal clerk who's giving you the death certificate of your father and makes you go around 10 times to be able to give it to you. That's also power. It can be a CEO. It can be a minister. It can be anybody. And I started to look at people with power as disabled people, challenged people. If somebody's got a defect in his leg. I can see the defect. And if he's limping, I would go and see if I can help him. But somebody with power, he's got a damaged brain, but I don't go out to help him. In fact, he doesn't think he needs help. So you got a very interesting conundrum. And so I think there is a need to have an antidote to power.
And yet, I mean, when you speak of leadership, all leadership is also power and its influence. So I want to come back to where we started, which is when you say leaders should look at from the top balcony, the much larger role of society building, other than the obvious of job creation and so on, what is it that corporate or business leaders are in a position to do towards nation building that you think we need a lot more of? Would you give us a few tangible examples of what you think corporations and their leaders can do?
You know, when you're in your corporate career, and I'm keeping to that because that's my subject, initially you're in swadharma. I must earn more money, I must get a promotion, I must have a bigger car, all that stuff. At a certain level in the next balcony, you must have Rashtra Dharma. You must think of the country, the society. So, you know, if you're creating a new factory in a place where there's no development at all, it is of course painful. It's much nicer to get a factory spot close by. But you're doing something. During my career, I've been associated, I didn't say I put up all the projects. Large parts of this country where we've created jobs, thousands of jobs between my two companies. Then, beyond Rashtra Dharma, you get Manav Dharma. What am I doing for society? You can't solve society's problems single-handedly in one company. But if every company did its bit and people had a leadership bandwidth and an empathy that I also owe something to society. And I've worked in two companies, luckily, which are very deep into this philosophy. And so those were the balconies that change your perspective and temper your sense of power. You know, in my book, Doodles in Leadership, I've described a conversation, an imaginary conversation, and if you could pull out the first 4 chairmen of Tatas, who lasted for 130 years. So the tenure of a chairman in Tatas was quite long. And if they could have a panel discussion with Algebra hosting it, what would they be saying about their business philosophies in the times? Because don't forget, this 130 years from the time it was founded till J.R.D. Tata died, they had seen 2 world wars, they had seen Hitler, you know, they had seen colonialism come to an end, the Berlin Wall fall. We are very major things that had happened in the world. And the one thing that come out is trusteeship. Gandhiji spoke a lot about trusteeship. And many people write essays on trusteeship. But if you work in Tatas, unless you're dumb or blind, you see it in action. And that is a great lesson.
Will you tell me what you mean by trusteeship in this context?
Trusteeship is, I happen to be here to serve other people. I have a temporary charge. And the profits that you know, we are trained in Tatas to work as professionally to save the next 100 rupees as any other manager anywhere else. But it's a source of some satisfaction that out of that 100 rupees, 30, 40, 50 rupees will go back through the structure that we have into social work. And since we are, kisi ne ghanti bajaya, so I must conclude with a little story which I find very inspiring, which by the way is available only in the Vivekananda Memorial booklets, books published by the Vivekananda Trust. The year is 1893 or 1898. Swami Vivekananda was in Chicago, and the world's richest man, the Mukesh Ambani of the world at that time, was a chap called David Rockefeller. And word got to David Rockefeller from a French disciple of Swami Vivekananda that there is a saffron-clad Swami who speaks very persuasively, and she persuaded Rockefeller to come. And when he came, there was an interaction which she has described in the book. And essentially, Swamiji asked Rockefeller, what is the salary of the average American? And he gave some number, say 100. He said, but you're worth 100 times that. He said, yes. He said, do you think you're 100 times smarter than the average American? And Rockefeller said, yes. He said, has it ever occurred to you that you just happen to be the instrument through which this money has to go back to the American people, which Rockefeller, of course, found offensive. And that is the concept of trustee. But to the credit of Rockefeller and the influence of Swami Vivekananda, between 1893 and 1913, I think, or 1912, Rockefeller didn't do too much about it, but in 1912 or thereabouts, he gave his entire money to the Rockefeller Foundation, which has done fantastic work all around the world. So that's trusteeship to me.
Are Indians a philanthropic people? Because the evidence suggests otherwise.
I think Indians are very philanthropic.
To themselves.
We keep beating each other on our chest for a variety of reasons. But the nature of our philanthropy and the reach of our philanthropy is very different from the American model. You must have money to give.
No, I'm speaking merely
Until the other
of
day, Indians didn't have money to give.
Yeah, sure.
And I think the nature of Indian philanthropy has been community and caste-based. So there'll be the Marwadi Education Sammelan, the Sikh Education Society, the Tamil, whatever. It's changing. Corporatizing of social work is changing now. And I am personally very optimistic. Everything is not perfect, but I'm very optimistic that people with a disproportionate amount of wealth will give it back to society. It hasn't happened so far, if you ask. You can quote Tatas and Bajaj and Birla and maybe one or two more, but I am very confident it will happen.
And I know we are out of time, but in 2013, I think you traced your personal family trajectory back. So this is not linked to your books that you've written about corporate life, but you traced your personal trajectory back and your family trajectory back to 1823, I think. What was the trigger for that kind of project? Why did you feel it was necessary to go back and learn your family history, give or take almost 200 years?
You know, it's also a bit of an aha feeling. I was very deeply impressed with Alex Haley's book, Roots. And then when I joined Hindustan Lever, we had a chairman at that time called Prakash Tandon, who was a great influence on young people like us when we joined. And he had written his book, Punjabi Century and so on.
Beyond Punjab.
Then I suddenly found what had to happen. My uncles and aunties were all disappearing one after the other. And I was already 40 years of age. And it just struck me that we don't have church records, and even I don't have a birth certificate. I don't know how many people here have a birth certificate. So I started interviewing people. I couldn't go and say before you die, but my urgency was that before you die. And I took notes, and I collected all this material to create not so much a history of my family, because that's not of great interest to anybody, but to trace back the patrilineal linkage to see how Indian society had changed. And then, of course, I got some books, I researched it, and then I put it all together into a book in 2013, which I titled A Comma in a Sentence, because I said each one of our lives is a comma, although we think it's a paragraph. Our lives are just a comma in a sentence which is going on for a long time and will continue for a long time. And like in the English language, depending on where you place the comma, the meaning of the sentence can change dramatically. And so what we have to do in our lives, we better do, and place our family comma in the right place. And I've tried to use this change of, for example, I got a story from my grandfather when he was alive about what his grandfather told him. Now, it's anecdotal, it's a story of how word about 1857 reached the village in Tamil Nadu. There was no Times of India, there was no Bombay Times.
You're making me rather nostalgic for that time.
Well, they were started around 1860 or thereabouts. But it is very interesting to see how word got around. I won't go into the whole description now. But when my grandfather told me about what his grandfather told him when he saw the first steam engine, it came to a station called Mannargudi, which is just 15 kilometers from my village. And he said, it took us 8 days to go by bullock cart to Madras. And now they said this huge puffing black animal would take me there in 8 hours. It was terrifying, I ran away. Now that's very credible. And computers and artificial intelligence do the same thing to us these days. So it's very interesting.
Okay, we are out of time. Gopal's books are available outside. We will take a break after our second conversation. I do hope we will use the opportunity, thank you, to buy the books and have them signed. Thank you so much for being here. And we hope to continue the conversations.